Hey guys, and welcome to PowerPoint 16. This is talking about the end, towards the end of the American Revolution, talking about Valley Forge, the economy, fighting, and Yorktown. So again, this is PowerPoint 16. So the American allies. So during the war, Spain decided to help Americans after Saratoga. So because America was able to win the Battle of Saratoga, that actually made other countries go, hey, maybe America does have a chance. And so Spain did not form alliance with the U.S., but declared war on Great Britain. So Spain was like, I don't think I'll help you, say I'm helping you, but I will definitely fight against Great Britain. So Spain kept many British troops out of American war. So Spain actually focused on fighting Great Britain, but they didn't necessarily want to help America. And then France, Benjamin Franklin, who the picture is over here on our left, was an ambassador to France. So France was kind of like an easier ally, and news of the American victory at Saratoga helped France to realize that Americans might win the war. So France sent money, equipment, and troops. Again, they weren't declaring that they were really helping just in case America lost the war, but they were willing to support in kind of more of a silent way. All right, moving on to our next slide. So Valley Forge. So this was located in southeast Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. It was a camp for the U.S. soldiers. So it was very cold. It was in the middle of the winter. It lacked decent food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Snowstorms and damaged roads slowed delivery of supplies, and many soldiers became sick and died. Some men deserted, and some officers quit. So Valley Forge was probably one of the harshest winters that any American soldiers have faced. And they didn't have shoes, they didn't have warm clothes, and a lot of them died, and it was a very, very difficult time. And some people thought that this would have been the end of the American Revolution, just because American soldiers weren't going to survive Valley Forge. All right, moving on to our next slide is foreign support. So listed below are some of the influential people who helped during the American Revolution that weren't actually Americans. So one of the most famous ones is Marquis de Lafayette, that's a picture of him right here on the left, and he volunteered to serve in the Patriot Army. He trained soldiers, he helped them learn new fighting techniques. He was actually a great leader. Thaddeus I can't even say it, Suzuko, however you say it, helped build important defenses. So he worked on how Americans would defend themselves, not just attack, but defend. And Casimir Pulaski became a general in the Continental Army. Frederick von Steuben was an officer in the Prussian Army and helped to train troops. Again, he was kind of like Lafayette. And then Juan de Morales persuaded Spain, Cuba, and Mexico to send money to the U.S. So all of these were influential people towards helping the Americans win the revolution. Okay, so moving on to our next slide is the economy. So the Continental Congress had no power to raise money through taxes. So Continental Congress couldn't ask the people, hey, we need you to pay taxes so that we can afford to even fight the war. Even with aid from other countries, Congress didn't have enough money. They couldn't pay the soldiers, they couldn't buy supplies, they couldn't do anything. So Congress caused inflation by printing as much money as it needed. So Congress just said, okay, well, we'll just make some money, and then that's what created inflation. Now, this caused inflation because the printed money was worth more than the supply of gold or silver. So technically, the way it works is for every dollar that's printed in the United States, like printed money, there has to be gold or silver to be its representative, okay? So you can't print more money than there is gold and silver. And because they did that, that's what caused inflation, and that meant that all of a sudden money was not as valuable as it said it would be, okay? And that's inflation. And that's why today everybody just doesn't get a whole bunch of money all the time, and they don't just print extra money, because then the dollar would be worth less. So people begin to doubt the money's worth, and the money became worthless. So again, like I said, more money you print, the less it's worth. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's how it works. It's kind of hard to explain. But just know that there's got to be enough gold to support however much money you print. So here's some vocabulary. So to desert is to leave without permission or intent to come back. Inflation is when it takes more and more money to buy the same amount of goods. Blockade is a measure that keeps a country from communicating and trading with other countries. Privateer is privately ownership outfitted with weapons. So usually ships or could be soldiers that are privateers. Siege is an attempt to force surrender by blocking movement of people or goods. Ratify is to approve officially. Ambush is an attack in which the attacker hides and surprises the enemy. So ambushes were very popular in the American Revolution because the soldiers, the colonists, and the patriots, they knew the land a lot better than the British, so they were easily snuck up on and attacked. And that was a lot of the way that they won the war, was being just more creative and knowing the land better. Okay, so fighting in the West, many Native American groups sided with the British because the British seemed less of a threat than the Americans who took their land. So they thought, if we side with the British, maybe we can keep our land. The Americans won the fighting in the West because George Rogers Clark led U.S. troops to capture a British post at Kaskaskia, the then Vincennes. Okay, the British recaptured Vincennes, but Clark's troops surprised the British again. So it kind of went back and forth, but the Americans kind of got control back over the Ohio River Valley, which helped significantly in the war. Okay, fighting in the South. So early Patriot victories affected the British because the British learned that winning the war would not be easy. So early on, the British kind of underestimated the Americans. The British had a new war strategy to use sea power and loyalist support to win the South. So they thought, well, if we can't win the war in the North, then let's go to the South where we think people who still believe in us will actually support us, and then we'll go to the sea because we know that the colonists do not have good sea support. At first it succeeded, but then the British could not control the conquered areas. So Spain started shipping supplies to the U.S. troops in the Northwest Territory. More Southerners started supporting independence because the British threatened locals to join the British or else they would attack their homes. So they started threatening them by, you either join the British Army or I will burn your house down. And that started the loyalists who were in the South, they started switching sides and saying, you know what, I'm not going to fight for somebody who threatens me. I'd rather fight for independence. Okay, so the war at sea. The British Navy formed a blockade in front of U.S. harbors. After the blockade, Congress ordered 13 warships and authorized 2,000 privateers. So people that even own just a small ship, they use their ship as a weapon. And so it was like private ships that were used for cargo usually or trading were now used as warships. John Paul Jones was the leader of the U.S. Navy, and he was successful at raiding British ports. So John Paul Jones was actually really good at what he was doing. And so it was, he became very successful in everything that he did, okay? Especially at sea. So Yorktown, Virginia. George Washington changed his plan to attack the British in New York, to attacking them in Yorktown. So George Washington wanted to attack them in Yorktown. Washington had learned that the French fleet was headed toward Chesapeake Bay, and Lafayette had Cornwallis trapped in Yorktown. So they had actually put Yorktown, that's kind of where Cornwallis, the general of the British troops in America, he had kind of taken up, that was kind of his base, and they actually had him trapped. They had him trapped. Washington had him on all sides, including the ocean. Okay? The Americans trapped the British in Yorktown because the French Navy prevented the British Navy, or prevented is what it should be, from landing, and the U.S. surrounded the Yorktown Peninsula. So because the French finally showed up with their ships, it kept the British from leaving or entering to help in Yorktown. The British surrendered because the U.S. formed a siege and the British were running low on supplies and their soldiers were wounded and sick. So our first picture here looks like George Washington, and that's what he is right there. That's him. And then the next is when Yorktown was surrounded by sea, by land, by everything, and then eventually they surrendered, and the U.S. were on their way to winning the war. So in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The treaty was signed between the U.S., Britain, France, and Spain. So all four countries were part of the treaty. The terms of the treaty: Britain recognized U.S. as an independent nation, so now U.S. was its own country. Britain withdrew troops from the U.S. territories and gave the U.S. fishing rights. So now the U.S. could fish off their coastline. They also didn't have the British soldiers in their communities, in their homes, in their towns. And U.S. promised to pay the British merchants and return property to loyalists. So if during the war, if the Patriots had actually taken some of the loyalist land or ships or anything, they did return that to them. Now, some loyalists just said, I don't even want it, I'm leaving the country, and they did. So how the Americans won the war. So the Americans fought on their own land, and that was significantly important because they knew the land, and they knew where the hiding places were, and they knew where the rivers were, and they knew where the homes and all of the things were. And so that was an advantage to them. The British had to get supplies and troops from Europe. So even though America was also had to have supplies and things come in, they also had them there in their own country. Americans also used guerrilla warfare, and that's not guerrilla like the kind you find in the jungle guerrilla. No, this is guerrilla that is spelled differently, and it means that it's like the ambush method. It's the sneak up, it's the attack from the side, it's I'm gonna kill you from a distance instead of face to face, because during this time mostly what they did was they lined up in rows and shot and fired at each other in rows upon rows of fighting. Guerrilla warfare was more tactical, more sneak up, ambush, like I said. And then lastly, rural people supported the U.S. So if you had a wounded soldier, you could stop at someone's house and ask for medical care and they would give it to you. Or you could ask for food and they would give it to you. So there were people that weren't even fighting in the war, supported the war, and that made a difference. And so if the British showed up at their house, they often wouldn't give them food and shelter and things like that. So it helped to be on your own soil. It helped to be in America to win the war. All right, so that's our last slide. Whoops. Anyway, there's the PowerPoint. That's our last slide, and if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot me a message. If not, I will see you guys in the next video.